The Pacific Ocean is by far the largest body of water on the planet. What this size means is that nearly every single one of the Earth's continents has a coastline along its perimeter, the only one left out being Africa, and by extension comes into contact with 6 of the 7 biogeographic realms: the Neotropic, the Nearctic, the Palearctic, Indomalaya, Australasia, and Antarctica, again with the only realm left out being the Afrotropic. If you're already confused about what all these terms mean, don't worry, I already made a whole other video explaining this all, so go watch it and come back here if you need to. Anyway, with only the Afrotropic left out, this makes the Pacific arena a true melting pot, where nearly all of the Earth's genetics can come together and build wholly unique plant and animal communities on the many islands scattered across this ocean, all of which differ from one another but together form a patchwork of interrelated ecosystems, a so-called 8th biogeographic realm. The only problem is that while the Pacific Ocean certainly has loads of islands just teeming with life, very few of them are actually big enough to support complex ecosystems beyond a few palm trees and seabirds. This limitation in turn makes it hard to find an example where the full magnitude of the diversity at hand is on display in the environment. In truth, there may really only be one place across the whole of the Pacific that's both far enough from any mainland and actually big enough to have developed its own full-fledged biota, and that would be Hawaii. Here we'll find the perfect biogeographical case study where its isolation, tropical climate, and extended natural history add up to what can only be described as the most fascinating evolutionary laboratory on the planet, but also a lesson on how vulnerable much of the Earth's most unique environments can be. So today, let's take a closer look at all the various aspects that make this place truly unlike anywhere else on Earth. Now, before we can get into the biology of Hawaii, we need to talk about its geography, and the only real way to do that is to first talk about its geology. Of course, it's no secret that these islands are all volcanic in nature, but what makes them unlike most other volcanoes, which typically occur in close proximity to fault lines, giving them a distribution pattern that looks like this, is that the Hawaiian Islands break this trend, sitting smack dab in the middle of an oceanic plate, nowhere even remotely near a tectonic boundary. Situated like this, the only way for volcanism to actually poke through the surface here is if it comes from what's called a hotspot, the result of strange and frankly poorly understood pressures coming from deeper within the Earth's mantle. While we might like to pretend we understand these phenomena, the truth is we still know very little about the Earth's core and what influences the magma beneath our feet, leaving the cause behind this Hawaiian hotspot a mystery to this day. But okay, let me speculate for a minute. You see, a while back, I made a video on the surface of Mars, and I used that map right there. And taking only a quick look at it, we can see this huge crater right here, the Hellas crater. And then on the exact opposite side of the planet, we'll find the massive volcanic plain known as Tharsis, again occurring without any sort of tectonic boundary present to support such volcanism. Or we can look at Argyre crater, a slightly smaller impact zone which sits directly opposite the slightly smaller volcanic province of Elysium. The idea here is simple. Asteroid impacts created these craters, and either by weakening the crust or by sending a plume of magma shooting through the planet's core, the energy of this collision event was transferred to the exact opposite side of the planet in the form of a lasting volcanic surge. Taking this concept and now applying it to the Earth, we can look at the Chicxulub crater in Mexico, created by the very same impact that wiped out the dinosaurs, and then going to its antipode lands us in the Indian Ocean at the head of a long igneous rock formation known as the 90 East Ridge, a linear volcanic province created as the hotspot beneath it stayed in place while the tectonic plate above dragged over it. Doing the same with Hawaii, we'll find its antipode falls somewhere in southern Africa. What's that? Are there any significant impact craters in South Africa, you ask? Why, yes, as it turns out, there is. In fact, it's here that we'll find the Vredefort crater, literally the biggest and oldest impact crater we've ever found on the Earth's surface. Now, while you're not going to find this theory in any academic journals or publications, not yet anyway, I just find it suspicious that the world's largest impact crater sits directly opposite from the world's largest volcanic hotspot. It just seems like they must be related, and if so, this means two things. First, the creation of the Hawaiian Islands is entirely the result of a cosmic coincidence, a gift from the stars, you could say. But also, considering the Vredefort crater is over 2 billion years old, if it really is the source of this hotspot, then it's likely been active for roughly the same amount of time, making this probably the oldest site of continuous volcanism on the planet. It means that at least some form of the Hawaiian Islands have existed on Earth for nearly half of its entire history. This has all been to say that even the volcanism that produced these islands is unique, and whatever the cause of this hotspot may be, the result of it was the creation of a chain of rather large islands nearly 4,000 kilometers away from the nearest continental lands. Like all volcanic islands, when these first emerged from the ocean, they had absolutely no pre-established forms of life. They were utterly barren, and so in order to amass a collection of plants and animals, every single species had to be imported here from a mainland source. But this geographic isolation sorta had a counterintuitive effect. On the one hand, being this far from any mainland made it difficult for both plants and animals to disperse here. But I've said it before and I'll say it again, life finds a way. And so the species that did eventually manage to make their way here could have come from 6 of the 7 biogeographic realms. Or, in other words, Hawaii's isolation is also what brought it into contact with the entire rest of the world. To really see what I mean, we can take a look at studies like this one that dove into the origins of the island's many plant species. Doing this, we'll find that despite sitting closest to North America, the biggest source of Hawaii's flora actually turns out to be Indo-Malaya, accounting for over 21% of the species here. I mean, to be fair, North America isn't all that far behind, supplying over 19% of endemic plant species, but considering the nearest part of the Indo-Malayan realm sits more than 8,000 kilometers away, or over twice the distance the islands are from North America, this really goes to show how Hawaii's positioning opens it up to receiving species from everywhere in the Pacific. Of course, this still leaves us, or at least me, wondering why specifically Indo-Malayan species have been the most successful at colonizing these islands. Naturally, there's no clear and straightforward answer to this, so I'm gonna have to speculate again, and the first thing I thought of was to look at the prevailing ocean currents. Doing this, we'll see Hawaii sits basically at the center of the Northern Pacific Current. To the west, the current moves north, potentially picking up seeds dropped by plants off the Asian coast and delivering them straight to Hawaii, whereas the current to the east of the islands moves south, potentially diverting any seeds coming off the North American coast down and away. In this manner, the North Pacific Gyre acts almost like a conveyor belt, carrying both Indo-Malayan and Palearctic species directly to these islands, and helps to explain why after North America, East Asia is the third biggest contributor to the Hawaiian gene pool at 17%. Looking south, however, we'll find the equatorial countercurrent, and past that, the South Pacific Gyre, which together make ocean dispersal from either of these southern continents much more difficult, explaining why the Neotropic and Australasian realms are the least represented in the island's flora, with only 12% and 9% respectively. Of course, ocean currents aren't the only things that disperse seeds. Birds do that too. Plus, Hawaii's tropical climate might also just make it easier for other tropical species to colonize it. And overall, there are a lot more factors that could go into this that I just don't have the time to talk about right now. But okay, if you do the math, 21% from Indo-Malaya, 19% from the Nearctic, 17% from the Palearctic, 12% from the Neotropic, and 9% from Australasia adds up to only 78% of Hawaiian flora being accounted for. So what about the remaining 22%? Well, this is where things get tricky. You see, an additional 10% is marked as having a widespread origin, meaning they likely came from other islands in the Pacific. After all, given that most of these islands are closer to one another than to any mainland, it only makes sense that these would be the most immediate donors. But even still, this leaves the origin of around 12% of the Hawaiian gene pool entirely unknown, though of course there are a few theories. Like many people pointed out on my video on the 7 realms, some of these plants could have been donated by Antarctica back when it still hosted plant life some 30 million years ago, or even from some of the realm's relict forests clinging to the bottom of South America and New Zealand. But to be honest, I just don't know about this hypothesis. I mean, 30 million years is a long time, and the circumpolar current around Antarctica sure would have made it difficult for seeds to escape the Southern Ocean. And then there's the fact that even if these Hawaiian species did come from the ancient Antarctic, considering most of this continent's fossils lay buried beneath miles of ice and rock, we likely wouldn't even be able to tell. But if that leaves you a little unsatisfied, don't worry, there is another theory. The best way to understand this one, however, is to actually look ahead of the islands, where just a few miles off the coast of the Big Island we'll find the Loihi Seamount, the newest volcano in the entire chain. In another 100,000 years or so, Loihi will emerge as the newest Hawaiian island. Like all those that preceded it, for a time, this new island will sit as a barren rock, utterly devoid of life, but almost immediately it'll begin to receive inputs from all around the Pacific arena. Of course, when talking about oceanic seed dispersal, distance is key, and so the most immediate source of both plant and animal life will naturally be the other Hawaiian islands. Assuming the same has been true for all of the islands that came before it, this appears to suggest a lineage of purely Hawaiian origin passed down over millennia from sinking island to rising island in perpetuity. This would mean the Hawaiian Islands have been seeding their own life here, possibly for as long as this hotspot has been active, giving it more than enough time to develop species unattributable to any other lands on Earth, and might help provide an explanation for at least some of the otherwise unexplainable 12% of the island's plant species. But again, any fossil evidence that give validity to this hypothesis sits hundreds or even thousands of feet deep atop these seamounts, and unless we investigate further, we may never get an answer to this. Either way, what we can see is that Hawaii is home to a highly diverse plant community, a crossroads of sorts, serving as a collection of life from all corners of the Earth. In turn, this unique assemblage of flora means that any animal that ever made its way here, no matter where it originally came from, would find an unfamiliar environment and would need to adapt in order to successfully inhabit these islands. Thus, the prismatic nature of Hawaii's plant life serves doubly as a driving force for evolution among its animal population, producing an equally diverse and unique collection of native fauna. Of course, being over 4,000 kilometers away from any mainland means the only animals really capable of getting here were birds, with the only native land mammal being, you guessed it, a bat, the Hawaiian hoarhoe bat to be specific, which yeah, looks about as crazy as you'd expect. Now, while it might seem boring to have an animal community that consists almost entirely out of birds, I'd argue that from an evolutionary standpoint, this makes things more interesting. You see, speaking in general terms, here on the mainland, most birds serve roughly the same function, being mostly small herbivores relying on seeds or bugs. And trying to be anything different often means getting out-competed by bigger and more robust animals like mammals. However, in an island environment where all these same niches still exist but aren't filled, this gives what birds do make it here the opportunity to evolve into new forms they never could have sustained in a continental arena. But okay, before we get into it, by now I bet some of you are wondering, sure, Hawaii's cool and all, but like, why is any of this important for us to know? After all, I don't like spending this much of my time on a project if there's not some greater lesson behind it. And it was only after making a video on the extinct birds of Eastern North America that I was convinced there is something to be learned by looking at all these islands. You see, while learning about the extinction of the ivory-billed woodpecker, the Labrador duck, the heath hen, the Carolina parakeet, and the passenger pigeon still did convey the environmental devastation brought on by colonialism, at the end of the day that's still only 5 birds to have gone extinct across the whole eastern US, a surprisingly low number if you ask me, especially considering how densely populated this part of the continent is. The opposite, however, can be said about Hawaii. While the birds that called the eastern US home were still vulnerable to environmental degradation and excessive hunting, by virtue of being mainland birds, the presence of land predators, fierce competition from all different sorts of animals, and interaction with diseases made them all fairly robust species, lending them a greater survival rate even after people started to arrive from across the Atlantic. The birds of Hawaii, on the other hand, all exhibited characteristic island tameness, where, because they knew no form of four-legged predators, were only used to competing against other birds, and never encountered the diseases brewed up on the mainland, were far more susceptible to the changes brought to their environment through colonization, altogether leading these islands to lose many, many more of their bird species, so much so that I had to buy a book just to make sense out of it all. Well, that, and I like all the pretty pictures. Right here on the first page of the introduction, we'll find this graph that might help convey just how much of a toll extinction has taken here on these islands. Put next to places that have also experienced colonization over the past few hundred years, we can see all of them, even the Mascarene Islands and New Zealand, pale in comparison to the loss of species suffered by Hawaii. In total, 77 known species have been lost across these islands, far more than anywhere else on Earth. Or in other words, just 0.003% of the Earth's land area is responsible for over 15% of the world's lost birds. This is what has earned these islands the title of the extinction capital of the world, a name I can assure you you don't want to have. What all this means is that in prehistoric times, the geography of Hawaii allowed it to become absolutely brimming with diverse forms of biology. So much of that has been eradicated over the past 1,000 years or so that the only way to really see, understand, and appreciate what made this environment so amazing is to learn more about the birds that once existed here than the ones that still do. Now, normally I don't like just listing things out. It doesn't add much to a narrative and it just gets pretty boring pretty fast. But it's honestly hard to convey the sheer number and variety of extinct birds any other way. So just this once, let me list all these out, all 77 of them. And then afterwards we can take a more in-depth look. I'm out of breath. More in-depth look at some of these, okay? Trust me, this will be fun because I'll have to pronounce all these really, really Hawaiian names with zero practice and you all get to make fun of me in the comments. So let's go. The giant Hawaiian goose, that one's easy. The greater Hawaiian goose, the Maui Nui Moanalo, the Oahu Moanalo, the stumbling Moanalo, the Kauai turtle-jawed goose, the Kauai mole duck, the lesser Hawaiian petrel, the Molokai flightless ibis, the Maui flightless ibis, the Hawaiian eagle, the Hawaiian harrier, Ziegler's crake, Molokai crake, Kepler's crake, Ralph's crake, Severn's crake, the Kauai stilt owl, the Maui stilt owl, the Oahu stilt owl, the Molokai stilt owl, the deep-billed crow, the robust crow, the narrow-billed Kioea, the narrow-billed Kioea, the Makawehi finch, the Maui Nui finch, the giant scimitar-billed Nukupuku'u, the hoopoe-billed Akialoa, the kiwi shovel-billed finch, the pololii shovel-billed finch, the straight-billed gaper, the sickle-billed gaper, the Maui Nui gaper, the scissor-billed koa finch, the Oahu koa finch, the wahi grosbeak, the King Kong grosbeak, the Mauka grosbeak, Pila's palilla, cone-billed finch, ridge-billed finch, the Kauai palm creeper, the Laysan rail, the Hawaiian rail, the Kauai o'o, the Oahu o'o, the Hawaii o'o, and Molokai o'o, the Kioea, the Laysan millerbird, the Amaui, the Lanai olomao, the Lanai olom, the Lanai oloman, the Alai olomao, the Molokai olomao, the Kamao, the Lanai ala, the Lanai alawahio, the Lanai alahio, alawahio, the Lanai allow. The Lanai alawahio. That's a skip from me. The Kakawahi. The Oahu ala. Oh my God. Oahu ala. The Oahu alaha. Oh my God. The Oahu alahau oahio. The Oahu alahio. The Lanai or the Lanai. The Lanai hookbill, the Greater Amakihi, the Kauai Akialoa, the Oahu Akialoa, the Mauinui Akialoa, the Lesser Akialoa, the Kauai Nukupuku'u, the Oahu Nukupuku'u, the Maui Nukupuku'u, the Oahu Akepa, the Maui Akepa, the Greater Koa Finch, the Lesser Koa Finch, the Kona Grosbeak, the O'u, the Mamo, the Black Mamo, the Laysan Honeycreeper, Po'o'uli, and Ula-i Hawane. Ula-i Hawane. See, I wasn't joking when I said there was a lot, but hopefully at the very least now you have some idea as to the great diversity of birds that once lived here. And okay, I can already feel you all getting riled up against colonialism, and trust me, you're right to be. But what makes Hawaii such a special case in this instance is that it was actually colonized twice in recent history. That's why here in the index of this book, we'll see the list of birds split in two. Extinctions mostly before 1778, and then on the next page, historical extinctions, or ones that have been well documented in science literature. The first of these waves came around 1,000 years ago when the earliest Polynesian explorers and settlers discovered and began to colonize these islands. Yep, that's right, it's not just Europeans who colonized and decimated parts of the world. That's more of a universal human trait, apparently. While the Polynesians who first arrived on these shores definitely would have immediately contributed to environmental degradation by, chopping down trees to build houses, clearing forests to set up farms, and hunting the local wildlife for food and feathers, the most impactful aspect of their colonization was actually what they brought with them, namely the dogs, pigs, chickens, and rats that were taken either as livestock or as stowaways. Once here, some of each of these naturally escaped and went on to establish feral populations that come to depend on the resources of the island, aka the birds, for their survival as well. And suddenly, these island dwellers who'd let down all their physical guards like the ability to fly, behavioral guards like making nests up in trees, and immune guards found themselves to be easy victims to the harsh reality that they'd grown vulnerable in this isolated island environment. The first of these birds brought up in this book was the giant Hawaiian goose. Now, if you've been watching my channel lately, you'll probably be familiar with the concept that oftentimes when small animals like birds migrate from a mainland to an island, the plentiful food and lack of predators tends to allow them to evolve into bigger and bigger forms, a phenomenon known as island gigantism, which, as we can see here, the giant Hawaiian goose clearly exemplifies. A descendant of the common Canadian goose, this was actually a relatively new member of the Hawaiian fauna when the Polynesians arrived, having only spent around 500,000 years in isolation here. This explains why it still appeared so similar to its relatives, but also serves as a good showcase of just how fast evolution can take place, considering that even over this short period, the giant Hawaiian goose had already become flightless, allowing it to grow bigger and heavier than the Canadian goose, which has to stay more compact and lightweight in order to be able to fly. But okay, if we want to see birds that spent far more time on these islands to the point where they actually developed adaptations to them, then we can skip ahead a bit to the Moanalo. A clear sign that these were present across Hawaii for much longer is that there wasn't one, but actually 4 different species of Moanalo, each one specific to a different island. You had the turtle-jawed Moanalo of Kauai, the Oahu Moanalo of, you guessed it, Oahu, the small-billed Moanalo of Maui, and the biggest of them all, not coincidentally occurring on the biggest island, the Maui Nui Moanalo of, Maui Nui. And if you're familiar with the Hawaiian Islands, what I just said will strike you as wrong, because, well, 1, the biggest Hawaiian island is clearly the island of Hawaii, go figure, and 2, there is no island in the chain even called Maui Nui. And to that, I'd say you're right, there is no island called Maui Nui anymore. You see, in my last video, I talked about Earth's lost islands, and we learned how just a few thousand years ago, sea levels were up to 120 meters lower than they are now, thanks to massive, faraway ice sheets storing huge quantities of water on land. With sea levels this drastically reduced, far more of the underlying seamount supporting these islands was exposed, connecting Maui, Molokai, Lanai, and Kaho'olawe into the single island of Maui Nui, or Greater Maui. Here, the small-billed Moanalo was forced to keep entirely to the highlands of Maui by the larger Maui Nui Moanalo, which, being the biggest animal in the whole ecosystem, dominated all the lowland forests. While all 4 of these were about the same size as the giant Hawaiian goose, you could argue they're all better examples of island gigantism, considering they evolved not from something that's already pretty big like a goose, but rather from a much smaller dabbling duck. Compared to their closest living relative, the Pacific black duck, we can see these Moanalo all went through a far greater growth spurt on these islands than the Hawaiian goose experienced compared to its ancestor. Another indicator of just how long these giant ducks had to adapt to these islands can be found upon a closer examination of their beaks. Like this, we can see they all developed a serrated edge, almost like teeth, which made them better for gnawing at plants. Well, that is, except for the turtle-jawed Moanalo, who was clearly just looking for attention. While their purpose was likely entirely for gathering food, they also had the unintended side effect of making them look really mean and angry all the time, which I just think is funny because they probably did bully many of the island's smaller birds. We can even see the giant Hawaiian goose had started to evolve in this way, not only serving as a good example of convergent evolution, but also as an indicator that they were all eating foods normal geese and ducks typically would not eat. This shows that all these birds were actively evolving in order to take advantage of open niches in their environment, and by the time of their extinction occupied a role similar to what deer occupy on the mainland. While that might not sound impressive, deer are actually often the dominant herbivores wherever they roam, and would have placed the Moanalo at the top of the island's pecking order. Of course, while the environment certainly helped shape these birds, so big was their impact that they too shaped their environment. And a funny manifestation of this can be found by looking at the plants they most often ate, like Cyanea platyphylla. Over time, these plants developed thorns covering their bodies and even their leaves, a trait rarely seen in island foliage, to defend themselves against being eaten by the Moanalo. Because these birds went extinct less than 1,000 years ago, a very short period of time in evolutionary terms, these plants continue to grow thorns even today, despite their main predators being gone, serving as a living memory of the time when giant birds still roamed these islands. Comparing Hawaii's biggest birds against the Nene, the sole surviving native goose, we can see it's definitely the smallest of the bunch and does little to convey the true scale birds had once attained here. Unfortunately, while these birds might have been the biggest and baddest of the Hawaiian Islands pre-contact, as soon as humans and their animals arrived, they found their loss of flight and bigger, slower bodies made them easy targets for any hungry feral dogs. And in almost no time at all, these giant geese and ducks had, well, gone the way of the dodo, I guess you could say. Of course, it wasn't just the big birds of Hawaii that were driven to extinction after the first wave of human migration. And in fact, according to this book, 42 of these 77, or more than half of the species, and likely a lot more that we simply haven't found any fossils of yet, had already been driven extinct before Europeans ever reached these shores, including many of the island's most adapted residents. While I definitely can't talk about them all, I would at the very least like to keep exploring the effects of island syndrome on Hawaii. So far, all the birds we've looked at have been herbivores, and as such, the island environment had a similar effect on them, allowing them to grow into giants compared to their ancestors. But as we should all know by now, the exact opposite can happen too, if an animal's mainland strategy was to grow larger, to either overpower prey or prevent itself from becoming prey. Its journey to an island could result in it shrinking over time, a phenomenon known as island dwarfism. In my last video, I featured an example of this where the huge mammoths of North America evolved into a species of pygmy mammoth when isolated on the Channel Islands. While no animals the size of mammoths ever made it to Hawaii, large mainland birds like eagles, hawks, and harriers did. The only one of these to actually have been present on the islands long enough to have specifically adapted to them was the wood harrier, a hawk-like bird that on the mainland preferred to hunt small mammals and reptiles. However, when the ancestor of the wood harrier found its way to Hawaii, it came upon a land completely lacking in its normal prey, and so in order to survive, had to switch over to hunting the many birds the islands had to offer. This switch from feasting on the meaty bodies of mammals to lightweight birds meant the wood harrier could no longer support its great size, and over time shrank into the smallest member of the harrier family. Unfortunately, despite having maintained the ability to fly, the safe island environment allowed the wood harrier's behaviors to change as well, as it started breeding and nesting on the ground instead of in trees, because, it's less work. Meaning once animals like rats and pigs were introduced, their eggs were easily poached, and once again were driven extinct by these invasive mainlanders. All in all, what I hope these examples of island gigantism and dwarfism help reveal is just how actively evolving much of the Hawaiian fauna was, a clear signifier that this environment was unlike anything the mainland had to offer. Of course, there were plenty of other birds driven to extinction by the first Polynesian settlers as well, like molducks, ibises, a whole collection of stilt owls, and so many krakes, all exhibiting similar adaptations to their island home, all equally vulnerable to newcomers. Meaning that by 1778, when the British Captain Cook became the first European to set eyes on these islands, the animal community had already been drastically altered from its natural state. That being said, by this point, most of the islands were still forested, with many parts left completely untouched. Or, in other words, there was still more left to destroy. And over the course of the next few hundred years, not only would a new wave of immigration bring with it more deforestation for establishing sugar and pineapple plantations, more introduced animals like cats, goats, sheep, mongooses, even wallabies, and more advanced technologies that would accelerate the settling of these islands, but they'd also bring with them an unintended passenger, the deadliest creature this planet has ever known, that would almost single-handedly begin a second wave of extinctions across these islands: the mosquito. Yep, that's right. Before the 1800s, the Hawaiian Islands were completely mosquito-free, a true testament to just how profoundly isolated they really are. And as a result, every animal living here gradually lost any sort of resistance or immunity to mosquito-borne diseases their ancestors might have had. This all changed in 1826, however, as whaling ships began to use these islands as a place to stop over and restock, dumping their bilge water as they waited, and unknowingly introduced the insect for the very first time. From here, the wet tropical climate allowed the invasive mosquitoes to reproduce wildly, and almost immediately picked up the diseases carried by the invasive chickens and began spreading them among the weak immune systems of the local wildlife. And this is the major difference between the two waves of extinction brought to Hawaii. The first, let's call it the Polynesian wave, most affected those species that had taken a special advantage of their island environment to adapt into some pretty interesting, if ultimately non-competitive, directions. Whereas the second, or American wave, reached any and all species mosquitoes could sink their teeth or proboscis into, or in other words, every single one of them, making this a far more generalized extinction event, claiming victims that may otherwise have been able to tolerate the rest of the changes humans brought to the islands. In total, 35 additional bird species have gone extinct since the arrival of American colonists, or about the same number the Mascarene Islands lost in their entirety. While I again can't look at every single one of these, there are two groups of birds that I think are worth taking a closer look at. The first are the o'os, a genus containing 4 known species: the Kauai o'o, the Oahu o'o, the Molokai o'o, and most sought after of them all, the Hawaii o'o, though there have also been some subfossil remains found on Maui suggesting the possible existence of a Maui o'o as well. Although we technically have no way of knowing what this Mauan o'o might have looked like, if their cousins from the other islands are any clue, I'm pretty sure it would have been a mid-sized black bird with some interesting yellow plumage just like the rest of them. Which is important because it was these yellow feathers that in turn earned the o'os a special role in Hawaiian culture. You see, the exceeding commonality of these birds in pre-American times meant enough of their feathers could be harvested to put together elegant robes, capes, hats, and staffs absolutely covered in these soft yellow feathers, turning them into the ultimate status symbol of Hawaiian society, only to be worn by nobility. This, by extension, resulted in these feathers becoming highly valuable, almost like a currency, and thus managed to support an entire economy of catching and plucking these birds. Despite their value, o'os remained fairly common birds before Americans arrived, thanks to the techniques used by the Kia Manu, or bird catchers, to capture and harvest their feathers, which left the birds relatively unharmed and allowed them to be released once their feathers were taken. However, when Americans arrived, you just know they brought their guns with them, selling them to natives and teaching them how to use them. It took the native Hawaiians about 5 seconds to realize simply shooting down the o'os was far easier and faster than catching them by hand, and pretty soon the acquiring of o'o feathers went from a methodical capture and release to a mass killing, where over 1,000 birds could be caught on a single hunting trip. Even still, o'os managed to maintain decent populations here until the arrival of mosquitoes, that is, and by extension, avian malaria, and suddenly they were all gone, all 4 species, and consequently their entire genus, wiped off the face of the earth for good. The point I'm trying to make here is that even with guns and a huge economic incentive to hunt them, not even this was enough to fully eradicate the o'o, and had it not been for mosquitoes, they might still be around today, which I hope serves as a clear lesson on just how all-encompassing of a threat these bugs pose. I mean, they literally did something all the money and guns in the world couldn't. Moving on, the second group of birds I'd like to talk about are the Hawaiian honeycreepers. The story with these is basically the same as with the o'os, and the real reason I wanted to bring these up is because they can teach us another symptom of island syndrome that I haven't ever actually talked about before, called adaptive radiation. You see, while their stories of extinction might be similar, the story of the honeycreeper's evolution differs wildly from that of the o'o. On the one hand, each o'o filled essentially the same niche as one another, just on different islands. This can be illustrated by comparing their beaks, every bird's tool for acquiring food, which we can see all look just about the same, meaning they all fed on similar things. When the common ancestor of the honeycreepers arrived in Hawaii, on the other hand, they found a place where a multitude of niches remained open. And so from a typical finch-like beak meant for picking up mid-sized seeds, honeycreepers developed bulky grosbeaks to pick up and open much bigger seeds. Examples of this include the King Kong grosbeak and the Kona grosbeak. Long and narrow hummingbird-style beaks were developed to drink nectar from flowers, as displayed by the many different Akialoa and Nukupuku'u of the islands. Fat parrot-like beaks designed to break into fruits and typified by the o'u, small sharp warbler beaks for picking up insects off the ground, which may have been the most common niche to spec into, so I'm not going to give any specific example for this one. Unique hooked beaks to scrape bark off trees to find insect larvae developed only by the kiwikyu, and one, the Akiapola'au, even specialized into a robust woodpecker-style beak, the only one of its kind across all of the islands that it uses to dig into trees to find embedded insects, which, lucky for us, might be the only honey creeper I've mentioned so far that actually survives into the modern day. Amazing as it seems, all of these different beak forms evolved from a single standard model, again serving as a clear sign of just how much evolutionary pressure animals faced when they arrived here. And okay, if by now you're thinking, this all sounds a little familiar, that's probably because it was this very same evolutionary quirk that Charles Darwin first noted amongst the finches of the Galapagos Islands, which had all undergone a similar, if somewhat less extensive process that ultimately led Darwin to come up with the idea of natural selection and, by extension, the theory of evolution itself. Although Darwin never made it to Hawaii, if he had, well, first, he would have absolutely loved it, and second, would have found much the same case as he had observed in the Galapagos, only to a far greater extent, and probably would have used the honey creepers as his primary case study rather than the Galapagos finches. But okay, one thing that always happens whenever I make a biogeography video is I always end up focusing more on the animals than on plants. Sorry, I just find them more interesting. But the title of the video isn't the amazing zoogeography of Hawaii, it's the amazing biogeography of Hawaii. And so if we really want to get a full overview of this place, we gotta look into the amazing phytogeography of Hawaii as well. The reason I find this worth talking about is because, like I said earlier, being volcanic in origin, every time a new island in the chain peaks above the ocean, they begin with effectively zero life. This means whatever plants arrive here first will find not only some niches open, they'll find literally every niche open, leading to the earliest plants to wash up on these shores to undergo a mind-blowing degree of adaptive radiation, more so than any animal ever could. Since there are of course more of these than I could ever cover in a single video, we're again gonna have to focus in on just a single plant group. The ones I found most compelling were what's called the Hawaiian silver swords, though to fully understand them we need to get familiar with their mainland ancestor. Nestled within the Sierra Nevada mountains of Southern California, if you look hard enough, you may be able to find the rare Caroquistea flower, a member of the aster or sunflower family. Approximately 5 million years ago, somehow, likely by bird, seeds of this rather distinctive flower made a trip to the California coast, and from there all the way to the Hawaiian Islands. For reference, Kauai, the oldest emergent island in the chain, is only 5.1 million years old, which means this colonization event actually predates all of the other current islands. While the Caroquistea likely arrived to a young Kauai, already host to whatever types of plants had been passed down by the islands that preceded it, at the very least there were still enough open niches for it to establish itself here. From this point on, the sunflower would witness new islands regularly sprout up from the ocean floor. First Niihau 4.9 million years ago, then Oahu 3 million years ago, Molokai 2 million years ago, Maui Lanai and Kaho'olawe some 1 million years ago, all the way to Hawaii just 500,000 years ago, each time beginning a whole new sequence of radiation unique to its location but altogether related, collectively forming what's called the Silver Sword Alliance. While of course many of these retained their small flowering forms, some, like Debauchio herbstebate, grew larger and more woody, becoming a shrub in the process. Others, like D. arborea, took this route even further, growing taller with thick bark on their outsides to become full-fledged trees. Naturally, wherever there are trees, the ecological niche for vines also exists, and so other members of the silver swords, like D. latifolia, branched out into what are called lianas that climb up and hang off trees. Of course, other members of this plant family took the literal opposite approach too, like here on Mount Waialeale. Standing as the second tallest mountain on the island of Kauai, Waialeale reaches high enough to force the moisture to condense out of the air passing over it, producing huge amounts of rainfall in this one isolated spot, creating an exceedingly wet environment at its summit that can only be described as a bog or swamp. Here, the soil is so continuously saturated with water that many plants actually find it impossible to survive here. Not the silver swords though, instead they branched into Dubautia waialealea, a cushion-like plant that can sprawl out across a wide area while keeping mere inches off the ground. Overall, the Silver Sword Alliance serves as probably the best example of adaptive radiation there is, having started as a fairly modest flower and evolving to fill virtually every niche available across these islands. And I hope you think these things are as cool as I do, because I'm not done talking about them yet. You see, another aspect of the Hawaiian Islands that makes them just so darn fascinating is that on top of their isolation, on top of their diverse gene pool, and well, literally on top of their lush tropical climate, these are also some of the only islands in the Pacific that are mountainous enough to harbor alpine environments at their summits. Or in other words, not only are Hawaii's flora and fauna diverse, but so is its very landscape. Meaning that if you started at the base of just one island, you can move from an arid climate to a tropical one, into a temperate zone, and end up in near polar conditions, all within a very short distance of each other, creating an incredibly varied patchwork of drastically different environments where both plants and animals fight to occupy as many niches as possible. This is perhaps most noticeable at summits like Mauna Kea's, where the harsh alpine environment has prevented virtually all species from penetrating in from the tropical rainforests below. That is, except for the silver swords, which, if you'll remember, got their start in the mountainous regions of California, and I can't help but feel this gave them some sort of an edge, as not one but two silver swords have moved into the alpine zone. First, in the highlands of Mount Haleakala on Maui, where we'll find, the Haleakala silver sword, and around the summit of Mauna Kea, where, you guessed it, the Mauna Kea silver sword grows. Together, these strange flowering plants stand as the only species present within the islands capable of making the jump to an alpine climate, while simultaneously serving as the best example of why they're called silver swords in the first place. While thankfully few of these plants have gone extinct, being impervious to mosquitoes and all, many still teeter dangerously close. The Mauna Kea silver sword, for example, fell down to a total number of just 41 plants in 2003, mostly as a result of goats let loose to roam the island. And if it weren't for the efforts of countless people working hard to breed and reintroduce these peculiar flowers, they'd likely be gone by now. Which brings me to the last page of this book that I wanted to talk about. If we flip all the way to the back, we'll find the environmental nonprofit organizations dedicated to helping the native birds of Hawaii. If you've watched this far, you clearly must be interested in Hawaii, and despite what this video might have made you think, these islands are still home to some truly mesmerizing plants and animals like these. So if you'd like to help preserve and protect them, feel free to pause the video and go to any one of these organizations to learn more about how you can help. Overall, I think the reason I felt it necessary to make what will honestly end up being like an hour-long video can be summed up in just a matter of words. A unique geology produced a land with a unique geography, allowing it to amass a unique collection of biology that once there all evolved together into a unique ecology, which if you didn't know is kinda what this whole channel's about. That's what makes the biogeography of Hawaii so amazing, and why I think it's worth learning about, because while both the Polynesian explorers who first discovered Hawaii and even the Americans that later come to colonize it knew little about the lasting impacts their actions would have on these islands, today we know better. And so if we want to prevent the loss of Hawaii's remaining 23 endemic birds, as well as the rest of its flora and fauna, we're gonna need people who know, who care, and who are willing to learn from the past to preserve our world's natural treasures for the future. Hey everyone, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this and want to see me take more up-close looks at fascinating islands, give this video a like and let me know what specific islands you'd want me to take a look at next in the comments. I hope at least some of you appreciate these longer videos because they never really seem to do well, which means I really need to rely on my patrons if I want to keep making more of these. So please, if you stayed around for this long and would like to see more videos like this in the future, consider helping to support me and the channel by checking out my Patreon. Besides that, well, at the time of writing and recording this, I'm super close to reaching 1 million subscribers, but I have a feeling that by the time I finish making this video, I will have already gotten there. So don't bother subscribing, I don't care anymore. I'm just kidding, of course, subscribe to see new videos right when they come out, and I'll be back soon with another one. Thanks!